Good morning. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to present this research in this context. I would like to begin by pointing out that I'm very aware of the fact that I live in a racialized society that can and often does hinder our imagination. I would like to thank my colleagues from the Mapuche Nation who have been tremendously generous with the material gathered for this presentation. While there is some indication that the precondition of coloniality is to continue to offer a burden of trauma and systemic violence to the next generations, in the context of Chile today, a shift is beginning to be seen. As many of you know, Chile is writing a new constitution, which for the first time includes the voices of some of the original nations of this territory, a constitution for a plurinational state, a quiñe in the Mapuche language. With 1.8 million people who recognize themselves as Mapuche, this nation currently represents almost 10% of the inhabitants of our country. As Elisa Loncon, a Mapuche woman who today heads the Constituent Assembly, points out, since the conquest, the Mapuche people have never renounced their rights, the struggle for land, territory, identity, and language, constant demands that seek to end racism, the denial of identity, and the plundering of their territory over hundreds of years. This paper aims to show the strategies of decolonization of the museum space that are emerging from the Mapuche spirituality and wisdom, and I will present 3 case studies. I quote Mapuche scholar Claudio Alvarado Lincopi. Indigenous objects currently inhabit a temporal tension between the patrimonializing drive that anchors them to a tradition with an air of the past and even nationalizes them, and their daily use and/or recovery by the peoples themselves, who seek to express their contemporary condition. Objects thus struggle between the petrification and their vivification. In 2019, the Mapuche artist Paula Baeza Bailamilla carried out in the Plaza Mulato Gil de Castro, where the Museo Arqueológico de Santiago and the Museo de Artes Visuales are located, the initiative My Body is a Museum. As she herself points out in the description of the work, inside a mobile showcase, I stand static wearing traditional Mapuche jewelry worn by women and dressed completely in black with my whole body covered. In Chile, there are museums that looted tombs and houses, extracting jewelry, textile, everyday utensils, and countless sacred objects that today are exhibited on faceless mannequins. This action shows the disappearance of Mapuche bodies that are still alive while state institutions try to erase our existence. My Body as a Museum shows the tendency to objectify indigenous culture. The body covered in black, in which only the pieces of silver stand out, shows the colonial force perpetrated on living human bodies with the aim of erasing their identity, and through this, to be able to later take their belongings and plunder their territories. As the academic Cristian Vargas Weke points out, one of the constitutive axes of Paula Baeza Pailamilla's work consists of approaching different reading proposals on the status of the Mapuche body, understood as a territory on which memory and historical, political agendas have a place. It is worth remembering that the colonization of the Wallmapu Mapuche territory has implied violence not only towards the bodies of people, but also towards the bodies of nature, both deeply interconnected. Hence, the artist continues by sublimating this anonymous representation, by submerging herself as a mannequin of those patrimonial values of what is permissibly indigenous. With her initiative, she manages to fully express the institutional critique of the model of the museum that is exposed and of the Mapuche representation in cultural spaces. Silver items acquired a special importance, and you can see it here up close. In the 18th century, forged on the basis of silver coins used in trade with the Spaniards, acquiring an important value as a status symbol for loncos and ulmenes, and for their women who wore these jewels with their ritual and festive attire. In a certain way, these symbolize the capacity of the Mapuche people to enrich their culture even in times of colonization, or as Alvarado Lincopi points out, the vivifying possibility. Not so much of the object, but of the people who colonized, have had to reconstruct even their aesthetic precepts in order to reclaim their living condition. I don't know if these are original pieces of historical value or if they are replicas. What is certain is that, as the ethnographer and anthropologist Anne Christine Taylor points out, with respect to the great aesthetic return that ethnographic museums are undergoing today, art has replaced science as the new language of universalism, yet the conceptualization of art that underlies the museography of these museums remains deeply problematic, as well as disconnected from the kind of knowledge that is being produced currently in the growing field of anthropology and art history. What Taylor mentions leads us to understand that in the criticism proposed by Paula Baeza Pailamilla, covering her body with these pieces of traditional Mapuche art, is making an urgent call to restore the categories with which the objects are called, since the art status that the pieces gain in the museum space is in turn what strips them of their political and ritual sense. Right now, the massive inflation of anything qualified as art, while feeding the process of patrimonialization, robs these objects of their vital force. Thus, the museums of the world are experiencing one of the largest waves of requests for the repatriation of native peoples, with slogans such as, "What right do you have to have our art in your museum?" In 1981, the Archaeological Museum of Santiago was founded to house and exhibit in Chile the collection that for several years had traveled the world with the exhibition Indigenous Chile, sponsored by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Located in the Plaza Mulato Gil de Castro and occupying a room within the building of the Museum of Visual Arts. The MAS housed until recently a collection of more than 3,000 pieces that by then was one of the most important in Chile. Obtained through research projects, excavations, restoration, and private conservation, these objects were exhibited for a little over 30 years under the Western model of museography of archaeological pieces, organized, categorized, and narrated by a different foreign and colonial gaze. It was in those same years that the presence of the collection of a chinchorro mummy belonging to the pre-ceramic culture of the same name, which inhabited the northern part of the Atacama Desert, and which are considered to be the oldest and best preserved in the world, that the museum board began to feel a certain discomfort with respect to its exhibition proposal, and even more so with respect to the origins of the collection in general. Suspicions that it was no longer possible to exhibit a human body began to signal the museum's need to make a change. This was also impacted by some adjustments in the heritage laws that generated a certain persecution of the holders of heritage objects in order to regularize their legality or make them legal. Also, MAS transferred its collection to the Chilean Museum of Pre-Columbian Art. And here you can see the original pieces of the Archaeological Museum, and you can see the current pieces here of the Pre-Columbian Museum of Art. This symbolizes their connection with the cosmos. Although the histories of acquisition of these living cultural elements are essential to understand the process of petrification that they undergo, they're usually not touched upon or made evident in curatorial practices, as we shall see below. And this is an issue that has transformed the policy of the MAS with the aim of promoting intercultural coexistence. This issue also opens up another problematic field, namely the return of the material culture deposited in private collections and museums to the people of the region. This controversy has so far been insufficiently addressed by both legislation and heritage practices in Chile. With this in mind, and looking at the experiences of other institutions, and with special attention to the debate initiated worldwide regarding the restitution of indigenous heritage as well as the forms of exhibition of these, MAS committed to bringing the archaeological collection closer to the native people to whom it belongs. And we can see this here right now, this image. It's a Mapuche cemetery. It's from 1890, and it is from the Chilean Memory File, photography by Gustavo Ramirez. It's similar to the images that we saw before. In 2016, the Mapuche filmmaker and curator Francisco Huichaqueo was invited by the MAS to curate the Mapuche objects in the collection. This call was for him the beginning of a spiritual mission, which has been weaving forces towards the restitution of the heritage of his people. Since then, the MAS Hall has housed Wenu Pelon, Portal of Light, an exhibition that is also a portal connecting two distant spaces, a tunnel through which the objects travel to find their original meaning. Although Huichaqueo initially declined the invitation, after talking to people close to the heritage of his people, such as Juana Pailalev, director of the Mapuche Museum in Cañete, and later the Machi spiritual leader Silvia Calfuman, they made him see the importance of this mission, because it would be an opportunity to generate a dialogue between the Mapuche world and the people of Chile, at a time when conversations were, as they are today, quite complicated, and it seemed important to use the strategies of visual arts and film as a tool to open a dialogue. Huichaqueo, who until then did not feel he was a curator since he only practiced filmmaking, he began to visualize ways of operating from Mapuche customs and spiritual traditions. And I quote, "Among indigenous peoples," he points out, "there is talk of the importance of the voice of the elders, of collective reflection. It is there where one connects with other dimensions of realities. The other space called Peuma, which is a space, the place of the dream for the Mapuche, a cultural practice that colonial violence has not been able to eliminate. Thus, Wenu Pelon emerged in that uncolonized space of the dream. Calfuman was summoned to a meeting with the curators of the museum to see the pieces. At the site, a yelipun, a prayer, and a purrun, a dance, were held where the Machi asked Huichaqueo to play one of the pifilcas, or Mapuche flutes, which had not been played in years as it was considered an archaeological object. And I quote, "What happened there," Huichaqueo points out, "was that the great distance between our world and this other one became visible. A fissure is revealed, and the non-dialogue, that is, the same sensation, I imagine, that must have occurred 500 years ago during the period of the conquest, a separation between one culture and the other." And then this exhibition design shows the selected objects, which have since spiritually begun the path of return to their territory, floating in space, without any labels that define them or narrates them outside of their own energy. In the same space, there's a series of film portraits made by Huichaqueo of different Mapuche personalities, showing an active culture, a culture that, just like the objects, has begun a very strong process of reconstruction of its identity, no longer hidden, no longer invisible, and no longer told by others but by themselves. And I quote, "The objects," says Huichaqueo, "come out of our fields, of our homes. They are of daily use, but they are also our ceremonial objects. They are now heading through space towards the radiance of the sky, spiraling upwards towards the portal of light. Dusting themselves off, they leave behind the conservation drawers or category, the archaeological labels disappear, Thus, flying, they shake their energy to regain the condition of living objects, bearers of wisdom. They are activated by our energy, our way of seeing and living the world today. And here, for example, we can see some of the activities that took place in Huenopelon. It became a Mapuche territory, basically, and they have a lot of activities and rituals and conversation spaces, and they celebrate the Mapuche world. And this is the celebration of Huetripantu, the Mapuche New Year, right outside of the Mass Museum. This is our third case. In 1969, the Juan Antonio Rios Morales Folklore Museum was founded, which today, after a long process of decolonization, is known as the Mapuche Museum of Cañete, Ruca, Kimun, Tañin, Bolil, which means the house that protects our roots, and is also named after Juan Cayupi Huechicura, who was the cacique who owned the land where the museum is currently located in the Lafkenche territory in southern Chile. Given the political context of those years, the museum opened its doors only in 1977 in the midst of the military dictatorship. The history of the museum is quite interesting in that its collection originated in a varied way and was exhibited under the label of folkloric for almost 30 years. In 2001, its current director, Juana Pailalev, took on the responsibility of imagining a more dignified situation for these objects. In collaboration with the communities and thanks to strategic planning achieved with the National Directorate of Libraries, Archives, and Museums, in 2008, the museum managed to reopen its doors with a new museographic idea. In collaboration with the Mapuche communities and through long conversations, some questions were raised, such as why a museum if we were alive, or how to show the Mapuche culture in its great diversity and spiritual richness. Listening to the voice of the territory was essential to open the museum space in order to teach Mapuche culture to the communities. And this is according to Rosa Huenchulaf. She is in charge of education. This was important to, like I said, show the Mapuche culture to the communities and also to the youngest who may, in many cases, have lost their traditions. One of the greatest changes that this new museography presented, besides freeing the objects from the traditional archaeological classifications of ordering them by type, size, color, etc., and showing them by their daily configuration in relation to each other, is that all the so-called bioarchaeological elements or human remains were kept to begin the process of reburial under the traditions of the Mapuche people. A spiritual consultation was carried out, a machi, they conducted a ceremony to know the most appropriate procedure, which is not one but several. And this is to understand the origin of the remains and thus to be able to request a Chilean state for their final burial. This process is still awaiting approval by Chilean law. We know that a museum is not only concerned with exhibiting or designing new museographies. We cannot forget that the museum has a social function. That is why it also corresponds to imagine from the Mapuche vocation itself what it is to be social, what it is to be a community, from the sphere of the museum. That's why, since these changes took place, the cosmovision of the Mapuche people, from the point of view of the communities, has been essential. And it is important to point out, says the director, that since colonial times, many of the Mapuche communities have been left landless by the advance of neoliberalism and monocultures. So, the museum space has also taken on the responsibility of being a spiritual and political meeting place where social and religious activities are held, and also housing a Inguatue, an open ceremonial space, a ruca, and a paligue. And here we can see the community playing palin. The image on the left is a current image. It was an activity carried out in the museum, and then on the right we have an image from the archives. We can agree that although the problem does not lie in the museum itself, which is one of the many devices forged during the last colonial and capitalist centuries, in the present that summons us, and perhaps it is worth saying the future that we are given to project, imagining how to reform the museum institution in which the so-called traditional Mapuche objects are housed today seems to make sense. There are still many questions to be answered, as well as many deposits or boxes to be opened so that thousands of objects like bodies may return to their territories of origin. In this whole process, which has already begun, spirituality plays a fundamental role in that it is the most loving tool. And here I am quoting Elikura Chihuailaf. It is the most loving way, yes, the most loving way to decolonize heritage pieces in a museum context. And it is here that the Mapuche tradition itself, like many other indigenous traditions in the Americas, shows the irreducible distance that exists in the way objects are seen and integrated into the world, their agency and meaning in relation to Western culture. Thank you very much. Chaltumay.